Hi, everyone. My name is DJ Angelini. I serve on the executive board of the Georgetown University Lecture Fund. And on behalf of our organization, I'd like to welcome you to the event this evening, Spotlight on the Church, What This Means for the Ordinary Catholic. Before we begin our panel discussion, I have a couple of announcements. First, I just want to thank our generous co-sponsor, La Jolla, for their support. And second, I want to go over a few logistical points. The Lecture Fund is committed to upholding Georgetown's mission of free speech and expression. The lecture today will consist of a moderated discussion, followed by a period for open Q&A from the audience. Make sure you ask only one question so that we keep your questions brief to allow for much discussion as possible. Additionally, while you may not agree with the position of the speakers, we ask that you respectfully honor their right to share their viewpoint with us tonight. So, with that out of the way, please help me in welcoming our introductory speaker, Father Matthew Carnes. Carnes is a beloved Jesuit here at Georgetown and a professor in the Department of Government. His research encompasses labor and social welfare policy, with specific focus on how societies protect their weakest and most vulnerable. The old, young, ill or injured, the unemployed. He is an important member of our community, and we are honored to have him speak with us today. Welcome, Father Carnes, and thank you.
Thank you, DJ, and thank you to the Lecture Fund for inviting me to introduce this event tonight. And I appreciate the way that the Lecture Fund has framed the evening's discussion as a spotlight on the church, especially its scandalous and deeply, deeply troubling pattern of sexual abuse, and especially as you framed it, what it means for ordinary Catholics. Because when I approach this topic, I feel myself very much an ordinary Catholic. Sadly, my experience of the abuse crisis has been part of my ordinary experience of the church, really the entire time I've been an adult. It's been there in some form as long as I can remember from really my middle teenage years. So when I entered the Jesuits back in 1992, before the major abuse that was so well documented in the Spotlight movie, first had really broken into the light. But after much of that abuse had already been committed, and we know a lot of the cover-up was already going on, while that moment was just slowly dawning on us, it was also sort of my gradual awareness of it was developing as well. We young Jesuits had heard little bits and pieces. Yeah, there had been some things. You'd hear about a priest or something that happened. But we certainly had no idea of the scope of this. We certainly had no idea about the nature of it, both within our order and within the larger church. We knew it was a major issue, but we really didn't understand just how deep it was. Although we could feel, even in those very early days, what a terrible betrayal this was of trust and the kind of justice that the church talks about. So in my years of formation as a Jesuit, I found that over and over again I had the opportunity, and really I found myself drawn to try to learn about this terrible scourge on the church, this terrible sin. And so in that journey, I've ended up reading the words of almost everyone who's on this panel today. And I'm thankful for the work they've done on helping us discover a history we probably didn't want to discover. A history that we easily would have tried to look aside from. We didn't want to see it. Basically, hearing about the truth, hearing about the abuses, hearing about the moving of abusers, hearing about the evasion of the law, these things are crucial to our transformation. They're crucial, first of all, in my own formation in disgusting me and disheartening me. They're also fundamental in challenging me to think about how do we try to have a path forward. So over the years, I've kept reading. I've kept reading all of you. I've kept reading so many others. I've tried to learn about what happened. I've tried to learn about the causes of what happened and continues to happen. We Jesuits have made training around this really central to what we do. I don't know if everyone knows this, especially here in the Jesuit community, but we dedicate at least one night every single year to re-talking about these issues, and then trying to think about how do we address issues that could lead someone to become an abuser even now. How do we address those issues today? But we have so much more to do. We have so much more to do. We're just starting to scratch the surface of this. So what I want to do, as maybe a way of framing the discussion tonight, or just to introduce it, is to close with three things I've learned, I think, from all of you. And I hope you'll correct me if you think there are other things that I should have learned. I'm sure there's still so much more that I need to learn. But three things that stand out for me now looking at this for over 2 decades. See, the first thing I've learned is that the church, like so many other institutions, fails to live up to its calling when it starts to become, as Pope Francis has said so many times, self-referential. See, when its point of reference is itself, and its own leadership, and its own teaching, and its own status, when its main interlocutors are all internal, this can lead to the misperception that we are our best judges by our own standards, and we can have a sense that, there's some way that secrecy or face saving would be better. You've helped us see that's not true. You've helped us see that so many people that thought, and I mean here bishops, I mean here, priests, I mean sometimes police officers who are complicit, I mean even journalists sometimes along the way, had this sense that, we can work this out ourselves. We can talk about this ourselves. We can sort this thing out. And what I've learned is that sort of inward-focused focus is never healthy. I've come to believe it never helps us to try to keep things indoors. Rather, we're always better bringing things into light. But we have a tendency in us as human beings not to want to do that. It can be really, really embarrassing. And so we need others who are outside that inner circle, and sometimes even outside the church, to help hold us accountable. We need their insights. We need their insights as individuals. We need their insights as review boards. We need their insights in the legal system. We need journalists. We need police people that help us see what we would like to not see. We need these kind of people. And we need the people here on our panel tonight. The second thing I've learned is that the sin of clerical abuse is a sin for which we can never adequately apologize. Indeed, we need to beg forgiveness from the survivors of abuse, from their families, from the people we've driven away from the church when they've heard about this, from those we've driven away from God because they couldn't believe after this. We need to ask forgiveness from God himself. In some sense, the lives of the priests of my generation need to be lives of penance. They need to be lives of constantly seeking some kind of atonement for this. It's part of our mission, and we can't accomplish it in one service. We can't accomplish it in one ceremony. We can't accomplish it in one conversation. It's got to be the project of a lifetime at least, and probably longer than that. We have much to do. And finally, the third thing I'd like to think is possible, and I hope you'll maybe address this some tonight. My sense that resurrection is possible in all of this, but it comes precisely through the wounded ones. In the Easter event, which the church just celebrated a couple weeks ago, we celebrated Jesus, the wounded one, who brings new life. And he still bears the marks of his suffering in his hands and in his side, and he's the one that chooses to reach out and reconcile on his terms. In fact, the disciples can't do this on their own. It's not surprising that actually they're hidden in an upper room, right? It's in this secret space, kind of trying to work things out themselves. But it's Jesus who comes in his woundedness, and in his own time, in his own way, in his own words, he's the one that builds forgiveness. He's the one that builds resurrection. So my prayer is that the wounded ones will be the ones that lead the church to resurrection. The wounded ones who, on their own terms, by challenging us, by pushing us, by helping us see again the wounds that need to be healed and will always be there, that they'll be the ones that challenge us, priests, us, bishops, us, the church, ordinary Catholics, to find resurrection. But for this to happen, we priests, we bishops, those who serve in official capacities in the church, we're so often comfortable speaking and leading, but for this to happen, we need to shut up. We need to actually listen. We need to hear the stories, and we need to be challenged over and over again. So that's what I'm going to do now. I've said enough. Now it's time for me to remain silent and keep learning from all of you. So thank you for what you've already taught us, and I look forward to what you'll teach us tonight. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aiden Johnson. I'm a freshman in the college, and I'm also an associate member of the Lecture Fund. Tonight, we are going to host a great panel on the Spotlight movie and on the crisis that it entails. And actually, we have a short malfunction with some of the microphones, just bear with us for that. And in that time, I'm going to introduce our 5 panel members tonight. The first of our 5 panel members is Richard Sipe. Richard is a certified clinical mental health counselor who spent 18 years as a Benedictine monk and priest, and he has also written numerous books on the sexual abuse crisis within the Catholic Church. Our second panelist is Tom Doyle, who is an ordained Dominican priest and canon lawyer who worked for many years in the Vatican Embassy. Third, we have Marty Barron, who was the editor of the Boston Globe at the time that the Spotlight team investigated this case, and is currently the editor of the Washington Post. Fourth, we have Mike Rezendes, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter who was also on the Spotlight team in 2002. And finally, we have Bob Bennett, who is a member of the Georgetown University class of 1961 and Georgetown Law class of 64. He's currently a partner at Hogan Lovells and was also the research committee chair of the 2004 U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops National Review Board, which published a groundbreaking report on the crisis within the Catholic Church in the United States. So, without further ado, our panelists. All right, I think all of these work. Can you guys hear us? Sorry about that. So, thank you all for being here, first of all. This is really an honor for you to be speaking at Georgetown, which is a Catholic and Jesuit university, and we feel really strongly that this conversation ought to happen here. So thank you all very much for that. And to explain to the audience today, the conversation is going to take place in 3 parts in the moderated Q&A. We're going to try and focus first on what happened before 2002 and the Spotlight investigation, and then we're going to focus on what happened during the Spotlight investigation, and then we're going to have a little bit of a conversation as to what we can make and what's happened since and how we can try and move forward. So with that in mind, the first question I kind of want to direct at Tom and Richard. We know that Marty and Mike both got into this during the Spotlight investigation. Bob was brought in after the fact with the investigative committee. But both of you had been a part of this crisis and working on it and investigating it before it really became a huge public issue. So I'm wondering, how did you two get so involved in this so early, especially when it wasn't that public about a crisis?
He's the real expert. I'll fire the first shot. I became involved in 1984. And at that time I was an active priest and I was working at the Vatican Embassy, which is not too far away from here. When we were apprised of a situation in Louisiana, a priest who had sexually abused, turns out, hundreds of children. He was a true pedophile, meaning all of his victims were prepubescent little boys. I was simply asked to handle it as an administrator, to answer the letters that came in, keep a file, and it was being treated at that time by my boss, who was the Vatican ambassador, as business as usual. This is unfortunate, too bad it happened, but we'll keep a file on it and move on to the next event of the day. Unfortunately for them, and fortunately for the victims, one of the families that was brought into this, that was signed up with what they thought was an ironclad confidentiality agreement and a payment, backed out. And they went to court. And for the first time, a family had brought civil charges against the Catholic Church because their little boy had been viciously and violently violated by this priest. It was within what's called statute of limitations, so criminal charges were filed and the media got a hold of it. And a very, very brave, insightful, also Georgetown graduate named Jason Berry wrote a series of articles for a local newspaper in the Lafayette, Louisiana area. And he wrote the articles not so much about the violation of the children, but about the cover-up. And this was the issue. That is the main point of all of this. It's the cover-up and the dishonesty. So he wrote this, and that opened the door. And this started rolling, and I was at first only doing my administrative duties, but became more and more involved because of my relationship with Jason, a psychiatrist who was involved with the situation, and an attorney. But what really clinched it for me was a trip I took to Louisiana along that time, when I met a little 10-year-old boy who had been one of the victims. And I met his parents. And my life was changed. When I saw that little boy and knew what had happened to him, I didn't say to myself, you can't go back. I just kept going. And I didn't ask questions about where I was going and why I was going there. But I knew that what was going on was deadly wrong. And I knew that it was not just wrong, it was evil. And what was evil about it was the cover-up. And we began to discover then, back in 1985, that this was a problem that lay beneath the surface and had been covered up for a long, long time. What was new about it was that the media had gotten a hold of it. What was new about it was that it was becoming publicly known, and other people were coming forward and asking questions. And so the lid was off, and in many ways the nightmare started. And that's how I began. I'm still involved. I've been involved almost steadily since that time in a number of other countries other than the United States and in the United States. And I have a lot more to say, which I won't say because I don't want to capitalize the event here. But what got me going and changed my life forever was, number one, meeting some of the children. But number two, meeting their parents. And I will just say this, and then I'll stop. I cannot find words in the English language that can adequately describe the pain that I saw from these men and women when they tried to describe what went through their hearts when they first learned that their little boy or their little girl had been sexually violated, and even worse, by a man that they had trusted with everything, their family priest.
Thanks, Tom. I think all of us have experienced some of the same thing. But my entrance into this was really quite by accident and quite academic. I was interested in religion and psychiatry and the interface between the two. And because of that, after I had some pastoral experience, my abbot said, I'm going to send you to study. I want you to find out or study about the mental health problems of Roman Catholic priests. So I went first to the Medical Foundation on an NIMH fellowship, and then the head of Seton Psychiatric Institute in Baltimore, which was a place that really, at that time, this would have been in the 1960s, many priests were sent who were in trouble with depression or so on. So already in 1960, I was doing a lot of counseling, a lot of contact with people, and I started to tabulate in my mind the behaviors that were going on. And so when I was at Seton, and it was a psychoanalytic hospital, and I was more and more getting interested in the dynamics of this, Margaret Mead came as a visiting professor, and she said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm trying to learn about the pressures of Roman Catholic priests. And I'm keeping this fund of data. And she said, well, what are you going to do with it? I said, well, I thought maybe I would try and have psychological profiles or something, that something could be, I didn't know. So she said, why don't you do an ethnographic study? Do it on behavior. Forget the diagnostic. Leave that to the physicians and the psychiatrists. You do the behavior. And so, with that impetus, and by the way, I want to give her credit and the Jesuit contacts I've had. I sent a letter to Aidan, and he knows my whole life story now. And Jesuits play a very important part in what I've done and the conclusions I've come to. So I collected this data, and by 1985, and by the way, I taught at Woodstock. I taught the theologians there in Maryland until they moved to New York. I taught at Loyola University in Baltimore. And little by little, I thought I had, and I was teaching at the Pontifical Seminary in Baltimore. I thought I had enough data that I could teach some classes on how to be celibate. Because if one is dealing with the clerical population, necessary to their lives is the vow of celibacy. So my interface became to the celibate sexual development of Roman Catholic priests. And by 1985, I thought I had enough data for 25 years that I would put that together. And I sent it to Archbishop Pulitzer, who was head of the bishops at that time at the NCCB. And he said, well, I think you need a lot more data. Talk to some seminary professors and you'll learn a lot more. I had been teaching already for so many years, I thought I knew something at least. So I put it together and I published a book in 1990 called The Secret World, Sexuality and the Search for Celibacy. In there, I put out what I thought was a definition of celibacy, which, by the way, has ended up in the Oxford Companion to Christian Thought as the definition of celibacy. And in there, I put down the data that I had and the behaviors that I had discovered over this time. And in there were two facts, two datas, groups of data. One was that 6% of priests, in my estimation, Roman Catholic priests in the United States, at one time or another, get sexually involved with a minor. I didn't put any diagnostic category, just put behavior. The other statement that I made was that at any one time in the United States, no more than 50% of Roman Catholic priests are practicing celibacy. Now, you know where the 6% went, and that got me into the legal field and as a consultant to cases of sexual abuse that are still going on. In fact, I've retired 5 times, and I failed. And on the way here in the car, Tom said to me, hey, we have this big case coming up. Do you want to be in it? I haven't answered yet. But that's how I got into the consultation with him. I want to go back to the other statement that I made in 1990. Well, before that, I'm going to go ahead to 93. And the first time Tom and I and Marianne were on a conference, was a symposium in Chicago. 300 survivors of clergy sexual abuse. And I said at that time that the problem we're looking at today, that is sexual abuse of minors by priests, is the tip of the iceberg. And if we go down to the foundation, it will lead us to the highest corridors of the Vatican. And I believe that that was a true prediction. Well, the second part, that I said, that at any one time in the United States, priests. I went to the Vatican in 1993. The Vatican put on a symposium, an international symposium on celibacy. And during that time, I met with Cardinal Jose Sanchez, who was the head of the dicastery, or the Congregation for the Clergy. And there was a priest from South Africa who'd done, a sociologist, who'd done a 3-year statistical study. And he came out at about the same time I did, with his statistical conclusions that of the South African priests, no more than 45 or 50% were practicing celibacy. Now, you gotta read my books to understand that. I mean, you know that sex isn't something that just happens. I mean, your energies go up and down, your temptations go up and down, the situations go up and down. So, anyway, the BBC was there with us, and they asked the Cardinal, what do you say about these studies that say at any one time no more than 45 or 50% of priests are practicing celibacy? And he said, and I quote, "I have no reason to doubt the accuracy of those figures." Now, if we get a chance to talk about the future, I may have something to say about that. But I have been involved in this wake. One of the things that made me so excited about facing you students, because I'm an old teacher, is that how if you let life happen to you, you're going to find something you never planned or expected. And it's going to be very exciting, very challenging, and hopefully very useful to other people.
Thank you very much for that. And then, before we move on to the segment about the 2002 investigation, one last thing that I kind of wanted to ask to any of you who wanted to chime in. When the church found out about these instances, whether it be before or during or after 2002, generally, and I know no two cases were the same, but what was the protocol? How did they react to it? What were their steps going forward to address that crisis that was at hand?
You can make certainly. Okay.
I've been involved in this on that score probably more than anyone else. And I don't say that to brag, but it's a fact. I go back now 32 years and involved in just about every aspect. In the courtroom, pastorally with the victims and their families. I've worked with the perpetrators, testified at commissions, and so on and so forth. When this blew up in 1984, there were a lot of people who thought this is a new phenomenon. It was not a new phenomenon. What happened in 1984 was the discovery of something that had been in existence for as long as the church itself had been in existence, where grown men, celibate clerical men, had sexually violated, in one way or another, vulnerable people. We were focusing on, at that time, primarily little boys, and then a little bit later, little girls, but there were also vulnerable adults. The protocol at that time was to, A, deny its existence vehemently. If the victims or their families came forward to any church authorities and wanted help or wanted to disclose it, the protocol was to, A, discourage them. If that didn't work, go all the way down to threatening them. But keep them quiet. Do not allow this to get out into the public, into the known world. Above all, don't go near attorneys or lawyers. The priests, the perpetrators themselves, if it got that far, in other words, if a report was given to a bishop or a religious superior, very oftentimes they wouldn't do anything about it because they'd say it just can't be true. But most of them knew this was true. When they got a report, this stuff was true, even though it was only known by a very tiny number at the top. So the protocol was very secretly, surreptitiously move the man somewhere else, to another parish, to another diocese, if he's a religious order man, to another province, to another country, to keep it quiet. The primary concern, and this still is something that shocks me when I say it, the primary concern was never the welfare, the harm, the violation of the child or the victim and that person's parents. They were not even a byproduct. The primary concern, and almost the sole concern, was the image and the welfare of the institution of the governing structure of the institution. That means the hierarchy, or in some cases the religious order, but mostly the hierarchy. That was the primary concern. And because of that, that was driving everything else that happened, the denial, the threats to the victims. It was driving the fact that the victims themselves were stiff-armed. They weren't even spoken to or approached by the clergy. The priests, a lot of priests wanted to reach out and help them, but they were told by the bishops, stay away. You'll only sensationalize the issue. And in '84, it hit the fan, big time. And then in 2002, what we thought was a tsunami in 1984 was a little minor rainstorm compared to what happened, what these two gentlemen brought about. So that's what the protocol was in a nutshell.
And Bob, I know you worked on that as well, a little bit later, kind of investigating how the church reacted to it. Anything to add?
No, that's exactly right. The hierarchy acted like they were executives that had insurance companies protecting the assets of their part of the church. Also, what happened routinely, I think, I mean, I have to really defer to these guys who were right in the middle of it, was if the priest denied it, that was accepted. I mean, the word of the family or the little boy just was disregarded, and case closed. The priest denied it. So, but even as late as I was on the National Review Board and did the primary research and wrote the report. You can see I'm color coordinated. The report. I mean, the church was simply in denial. I mean, it was the fear of scandal, and you know, in many instances, bishops would send the priest to a friendly Catholic psychiatrist, who in a month would write a letter back and say, Father so-and-so is all better. And of course, these are not the kinds of things that you're all better, you know. So, no, that was, you know, that was my experience. And you know, what really surprised me is we were not a committee of plaintiffs' lawyers. We were appointed by the Bishops' Conference to look into this. I think it was such a public uproar that they had to do something, and they picked this group of Catholic lay people. But there was a lot of resistance, you know, on the part of a lot of the hierarchy, and we just had to drive ahead and do pretty much everything that we could do. I'll tell you one light note in a very serious discussion is that we thought it would be easy, and we wanted to go over to the Vatican to talk to a few people. One of them was part of Ratzinger, who later became Benedict. And so we got in touch with the nuncio here in Washington and said, you know, we'd like to arrange for some interviews in Rome. And we didn't even talk to him, but some subordinate said, no, he just doesn't feel it's appropriate to meet with you. So I sent a fax. Today it would have been an email, but then it was a fax to the Vatican and to Cardinal Ratzinger's office. And he sent a fax back, said, happy to talk to you. So we went over and spent hours with them. And when they heard that we had faxed them, they said, we can't do that. That's not, I said, well, I went to the nuncio, he would help, so, you know, I'm a trial lawyer, I'm used to getting a hold of witnesses. Anyway, a light moment and a serious discussion.
I was interviewed for this report by Mr. Bennett, and even though I sometimes can't remember what I had for breakfast, I do remember vividly that interview. And at one point you asked me something about why are the bishops doing this, and I said they're acting more like CEOs, and you said, no, they're acting more like risk managers. And for, a gentleman who's supposed to be on their team to say that, it validated a lot of what I had been seeing and thinking and saying. And at times wondering, am I nuts? Am I crazy? Or is this whole thing really happening? And so your assessment was right on target.
So with that context being said, maybe we move on now to 2002, and to the Spotlight team, Mike and Marty. Seeing all that, when the Spotlight team started looking into this crisis in Boston, they really could have started looking into anything. Any topic really could have been chosen. It was a turning point. Why was it abuse within the church that was selected?
Well, as the movie portrays, when I got to Boston in the summer of 2001, the day before I started work, I read a column in the Boston Globe written by Eileen McNamara, who was a prize-winning columnist. And she wrote up a case of a priest by the name of John Gagan, who had been accused of abusing as many as 80 kids. It turned out to be more than that. And in that column, she said that the attorney for the survivors, those who had been victimized by abuse, was Mitchell Garrison, who's portrayed in the movie, was alleging that the cardinal himself knew about this abuse, as well as his lieutenants, and that they allowed him to be reassigned from parish to parish without notifying anybody about his pattern of serial sex abuse. And the attorney for the archdiocese said that those were false charges, that those were baseless charges. And at the end of the column, she said that the truth may never be known because the internal documents that might reveal the truth were under court seal. And so when I started the next day and went to my first morning meeting, which then was at 10:30 in the morning, this is very much portrayed in the movie. They went around the table, people talked about what they were working on, and nobody was working on that story. And so I said that I was interested in this case, and you had one side saying one thing, you had another side saying something else. What could we do to actually get it? Who was telling the truth here? That we have serious allegations here. And it was pointed out to me that the documents were under seal, which I said I knew because I had read the column. And that, but that, I didn't know the laws of Massachusetts, but in Florida, which has a very expansive public records law, although these are not public records, but our inclination would have been to automatically go to court to try to get these documents, to unseal these documents on the grounds that there was a public interest in them. After all, the church was responsible for the care of so many children. It had a responsibility to ensure their safety. And so I said that we consider the possibility of filing a motion to unseal the documents. And the response was, well, silence. I think that people were kind of stunned that on my first day, at my first meeting, I would talk about this idea of filing a motion to challenge the church, which was then, I think, safe to say, the most powerful institution in Boston. And so, not knowing what to do with all that silence, I said, why don't we meet after the meeting and talk about what to do? And we did. We then made contact with our outside counsel, whom I did not know. I had no idea what his name was, but a fantastic lawyer, John Haldane. And he said he would pursue it, and that's what we did. And then I remember telling Eileen, by the way, we're gonna take a look at this thing. We might file a motion. And she said, oh, that's great, but and she's very feisty. She said combative and all that. And she said, oh, we've never really done a good investigation of this. And I said, really, you haven't? And she said, no. No. And so we got together again, and I said, well, what about we do a real investigation? And so we were on parallel tracks. One was in the courts, one was on the reporting side. Just as portrayed in the movie, you have something going on in court, then you have the reporters in the field. And then they took it from there. We started with this one priest, and obviously there was an interest in determining whether he was the only one. You can almost always assume that there's never just one. There's almost always a pattern. So we might just talk about it from there.
And then with that in mind, I think the question I would have for you, Mike, is this isn't, as we've seen, I mean, this isn't the first case in the U.S. at that time. It wasn't the first case in Boston. But, I mean, generally, the spotlight work is looked at as this turning point. And whether it's awareness or whether it's more people coming out and saying it happened to me. Why was it that Boston was so powerful? Was it the number of priests that you found? Was it the in-depth research? What do you think?
Well, it's probably the number. And I always tell people that the Boston Globe Spotlight team did not discover clergy sex abuse, not by any stretch of the imagination. You know, there was a scandal that Tom mentioned in Louisiana. There was a previous scandal in Dallas, Texas, the Rudy Goss case. And there was a scandal in Massachusetts, in the neighboring diocese of Fall River, 10 years before the Spotlight team came along. So we didn't discover this evil, this phenomenon by any stretch. But there were two things about our reporting that I think were very different than what had come before, certainly in terms of scale. One, again, was the cover-up. It wasn't just that John Gagan had abused more than 100 children over 30 years in 6 different parishes in the Boston Archdiocese. It was that Cardinal Law knew. Cardinal Law and his top bishops knew about John Gagan, and they allowed him to continue working as a priest and molesting more children. And I think this really shocked and frankly enraged parishioners. And the second thing, as you suggested, is the scope of the problem. We also reported just a few weeks later that 70 priests in the Boston Archdiocese alone had been incredibly accused of molesting children and young people. And I think that also just shocked and enraged parishioners, even the most devout and conservative parishioners. And I think it was that double shotgun blast that really made our work different. Then the third thing that made our work different is we didn't stop there. We continued our reporting, and the court motion that Marty mentioned was a success. To our surprise, we won our battle in court. We were going up in front of a judge with 16 years of Catholic education, so we were frankly pessimistic. But we won our motion, and it became a precedent, became a legal precedent, and as a result, over the course of the next year, we got almost all the records of all the priests who had been incredibly accused of molesting children. And so over the next 12 months, we expanded our team from 4 people to 8 people, and we published an additional 600 stories until finally on December 13th of 2002, Cardinal Law finally resigned and left for Rome.
I would add to that, what number we got, 3 or 4, whatever it was. To add to that is that we were able, through that motion, we were actually, I think it's important to say, that we were able to get the internal church documents. So that was something that was sort of a treasure for us journalistically, but also absolutely critical in terms of establishing the credibility of what we were saying. So you could actually see how the church officials were responding as like risk control people. How they were responding like almost like an insurance company, form letters essentially to the parents of people who had, young people who had been victimized. You could see the promises they made that the problem would be taken care of, and then you could see the instructions that the priest was being reassigned to another parish. So nobody could say, nobody in the church could say that we were sensationalizing anything. Nobody could claim that we were anti-Catholic, or that we were exaggerating. We actually were able, since the internet by then was invented, thank God it was invented by then. We were able to actually put the documents online, and we actually published many of them in the paper, but we put them online, and people could see for themselves. People all over the world could see for themselves. And I think also importantly, because there was an internet era, this allowed people, it's been described as really the first big internet story. And so people all over the world were able to compare notes. And no longer was the church able to say this was an isolated case. People could all describe their cases that they all knew about. They could all confer with each other. They could communicate with each other. They could organize as they have. And they were able to mobilize to advocate on behalf of abuse survivors. And so I think all of that put together is what lent so much power to.
What year was it those documents put out on the internet?
2002. January 2002. We put them out with the first story.
And then we put out something.
Yeah. And you see what happened then, I think, is the church couldn't, the hierarchy couldn't deny it. I mean, you guys did an amazing job. You had to do something. And something they did is they created this National Review Board, of which I was a member, and it was a very high-powered board. I mean, what I brought to it was the lawyer skills and a big law firm behind me that could do the investigation, but we had people like Leon Bennett, Justice Ann Burke, a couple of presidents of universities, Bill Burley, who was the head of the Scripps Howard newspaper chain. It was a very high-powered board, and we were tasked with the job of investigating it and identifying the causes of it. This is not directly at point, but one thing that troubles me is in this era of budget cutting, how many more stories will not be told because investigative reporters are few and far between. So, you guys absolutely, the question I'm asked all the time at the cocktail parties now is, was the movie accurate? And I say it absolutely was accurate as far as I can tell. But they did an unbelievable job. So you can sort of see the pattern. Sipes and you guys started it, you guys got it out there, and then they picked the board, which I think to the surprise of some was an incredibly independent board. I mean, we had to chase cardinal law, and we didn't have subpoena power, but we did have the power of saying, well, I'm going to write this report, and your name's going to be in it if you don't talk to me. And on my 6th request, he agreed. Again, another light moment. Ann Burke, Bill Burley, and I were in Rome when we were seeing Cardinal Ratzinger, and we had this tense relationship, you can imagine, with Cardinal Law, and we had this crazy Italian driver who was taking us to dinner, and sure and behold, there was Cardinal Law stepping off the curb, and we came that close to hitting him. And I could just see the headlines. National Review Board wipes out Cardinal Law.
I like how you use all these techniques that we use in reporting. It's like, if you don't talk to us, your name's going to be.
I learned.
I know you say no, we couldn't talk to them, but I contacted them directly.
I've learned from you guys.
Very strong echo.
Yeah.
So from there, maybe we move on to the rest of this discussion, which is focusing in on what we can do from here and how we, as Catholics, or just people in general, should interpret this, deal with it, and try to move forward. And I want to open this question up to any of you who want to answer it, but you look back to 1962 and to Vatican II, and a lot of people think that changed the church for the better, and that it brought a lot of people back, but it was some drastic changes that were made. So if tomorrow the Catholic Church were doing a Vatican III to try and address this issue, what would any of you recommend?
Well, let me take that, if you don't mind, on a couple of things. Screening of priests is critically important to people who are applying. You're asking someone to give up sex for the rest of their life, and you better screen people like that, very carefully. And, to some, celibacy is an incredible burden, and to others, it's a gift. And why I say that is I remember interviewing this one priest, and I said, how did you get into the priesthood? He said, I'll be honest with you, Mr. Bennett. He said, I was lost, and I'd pick up men at a bar and would do various acts for money, and I drank too much, and one day this priest came in and said, why don't you give up this life and join the priesthood? And he said, I did. And he said, I said, well, didn't they ask you these questions? He said, no, nobody's ever asked me these these questions. I understand today there's a pretty detailed, or supposed to be anyway, interrogation. The second thing we found was, while they required celibacy, they really didn't help young priests live a celibate life. I mean, you guys would know more about this than me, but one priest after another would say it was something they just didn't talk about. And, as one priest said to me, cold showers only go so far. And, so there was no real effort to, people just didn't really want to talk about it. So I think that's a second thing that came across.
One of the key issues of this phenomenon, and I don't call it a crisis anymore or a scandal, it's a phenomenon, and what it is a revelation of the dark side of the Roman Catholic Church that we haven't seen too clearly. Now we see it. And the bishops and others are talking about ways to change it so that this doesn't happen again, so nothing happens. The issue, I think, from my many years of experience in many levels, it's the very concept of what the church is. Because what it is, and what it is in the minds of the leadership, is what has caused and prompted the cover-up, the lying, the treating the victims as if they're the enemy, demonizing them. And what it is conceiving of the concept of church as an institution that is owned and run by a very tiny elite of celibate men. I testify in court all over the world as an expert witness, and a question that is very often posed to me is, how often have you testified for the church? And I'll generally say, well, I always do. You get this puzzled look on the face of the defense attorney. What do you mean you always do? I says, yeah, I always do. And then they ask for an explanation. I say, see those people over there, the victims? They are the church, my friend, and don't you forget it. And that's the core issue. These people who've been violently abused, their parents, their friends, their associates, those who defend them, those who support them, they are the body of Christ. And somehow or other, the leaders of this outfit have forgotten that or refused to acknowledge it. Because the ones who should be given first consideration and haven't been consistently, and Dick and I have been in this for the long haul, and we've seen it consistently, the ones who should be number one in concern are the ones who are not. They are the ones who have been harmed and almost ruined. Common concept, a common definition of what has happened to these people is called soul murder. And that's a very accurate description of what happens when you're violated by a priest. So my thought for the future is this entity that we call church has to really start seriously rethinking what it is, and not only talking about being the body of Christ and people of God, but being it. And being has to start at the top of the monarchical chain. And it has to be no more words, but it has to be real.
A big part for the future is who you let in, The thing that, people always ask you the question, well, what shocked you or what surprised you? And I'll tell you what surprised the hell out of me. Because I'm filled with Catholic guilt. I mean, my Irish mother and the Jesuits filled me with all sorts of I would have thought, and did think when I started this 2-year project, that a priest who molested a child would be racked with guilt because of the inconsistency of being a priest. And I was wrong. These guys were arrogant. They didn't see where they were doing anything particularly wrong. They felt sleeping with a little boy didn't violate the vow of celibacy. And I talked to Paul McHugh, who you where he was the head of psychiatry at Hopkins. And I said, I can't believe this. He said, he said, I treat these guys all the time. They don't see where they're doing anything particularly wrong. Was that your experience?
This is true, and part of the dynamic of this entity is that the transfer of guilt goes to the victim. The perpetrator doesn't feel guilty. I loved him, I loved her. And Tom and I could explain some of the terrible, terrible ways in which some of these violators, and I will tell you what, this priest was abusing this 13-year-old girl. And he took what he told her was a consecrated host. And he held it to her genitals before he had sex with her. And he said, I want to show you how much Christ loves you. I mean, really, you get into this and change is everything. But this is part of the dynamic, Bob, and part of the essence of the dynamic that keeps it going on. You know, that the guilt is transferred.
I'd like to throw one thing in. Am I turned on? I guess I am.
You're on.
There was a moment in the movie that I found probably the key moment in the movie. And that's when the team was talking to the editor, Marty, and you told him to focus on the systemic issue, which is that's the core, that's the issue, not on cardinal law or the personalities. What got you to that point?
We had this meeting, I mean, it was the movie had this information, the reporters weren't there, but there was a meeting of the editors to talk about the story. And I was very concerned that we would just have a story that said there were a lot of priests. And I thought that it would be interpreted as a sensational story, to say, wow, look at how many priests we have. And I was also aware that there were other cases that had surfaced in the past. And so I didn't want it to be like, wow, did we just have lots here? So I was very concerned about that, and to me the core issue was not even the numbers. There's a lot of numbers games about what percent of priests abuse and all of that. And to me that wasn't the issue. The issue is when the church finds out about the abuse, what does it do? What it does is it tries to cover up, it keeps it secret, and reassigns those priests where they can abuse again and again, and that is the policy and practice of the church, then that's what we need to focus on, and that's the real story. And subsequent to that meeting, I actually sent a memo to Walter Robinson Robbie, and they used that memo as the basis to construct a dialogue for that scene, because they talked about getting into the policy and practice of the church. So, that's what I focused on. As to what the church can do, I'm a little bit odd position here, because as you may know, I'm not Catholic. So it's not, in a way, not my place. But that said, I'll say something. And, it's very simple. And I was struck recently when there's a Monsignor on this commission for the families at the Vatican. I think his name is last name Anatol. And oddly enough, he said recently, within recent months, that if a bishop finds out that a priest has abused someone, the bishop is under no obligation to report that abuse to law enforcement authorities. And that was this year. This year, okay? How anybody can say that this year is amazing. It's very simple. When you find out someone has committed a crime, you report it to law enforcement. It's that simple. And I don't know why that hasn't been able to sink in the Vatican. I just don't understand that. It was striking to me. There have been so many moments that have been striking me. I know a lot of people have great hope in this particular pope. But, it was last summer that the Vatican announced that it would form a tribunal to deal with the accountability of bishops. And this is sort of one of the big outstanding issues is, okay, you get the priests out of ministry, but what about the bishops who allow them to abuse? How are they being held accountable? And so the Pope, to some fanfare, announced that there would be this commission. But nobody has, to date, been actually appointed to that commission. No one has been named to that commission, and there seems to be no prospect of anybody being named to that commission. So, what does that say? And when the Pope was here in Washington, he met with the bishops, And he said, in meeting with the bishops, he said he praised them for their courage in dealing with this issue. I was so struck by that statement because if there was one thing that the priest did not demonstrate, it was courage. There was no courage. There was only defiance, denial, and obstruction. Courage didn't see any of that. And so, and fortunately, the press confronted the Pope about that statement on the plane back to Rome, and he kind of backpedaled on the issue. But to me, there are a lot of problematic signals coming out of the Vatican at the moment. And to me, it's very simple. It's like somebody commits abuse, you report them to law enforcement. A bishop is aware of a priest abusing, they need to report it to law enforcement. A bishop who doesn't do that should be held accountable for not doing that, as would an employer in, let's say, private industry or in government. And I think it's very simple.
Do you think, because I don't know the answer to this, I know part of the answer. When Cardinal Law or others transferred priests, they should have known that there would be repeat conduct. But do you think they did know?
Yeah, I mean, how could they not know? It had happened over and over and over again. We have examples of literally dozens of priests abusing, getting put on the shelf, getting sent for so-called treatment, coming back, going to another parish and abusing again. This happened countless times. And at one point we got Cardinal Law's personal calendar, and we saw that he had personally met with dozens of these priests and essentially forgiven them and reassigned them. How could they not know? Of course they knew.
I can answer part of that, and I think Dick could. I've seen countless situations over 30 years where the bishops had concrete, detailed knowledge of patterns of abuse that continued, and the man was repeatedly put back in some form of ministry, never supervised, never monitored, and allowed to go on. And you say, why could that possibly happen? I think it possibly happens because there's a chasm between the reality that these men, the bishops, live in, and the reality that we live in that is, you cannot breach it. It's just an unrealistic view of humanity and of the real world. And a complete lack of appreciation for these children and their parents.
You know, when we got the records in the Gagey case, there's 10,000 pages of records just on one priest who'd been treated so many times. And that was so totally apparent and appalling. There were many letters from Cardinal Law to Father Gagan, and the letters would have almost a very friendly tone, and they all said something to the effect of, "Dear Jack," it was always "Dear Jack." "Dear Jack, we're so grateful for your ministry, and we're sorry you had this bump in the road in your marvelous career, and we're all looking forward to you coming back." And there were many of these letters. Because
that had a big impact on our board, that one of those letters,
and the other
we
part
just
of it,
all shook our heads about
and the other part of it, 10,000 pages, never do you see a letter to a victim or the parent of a victim exhibiting the same sort of compassion, the same sort of understanding. Absolutely never.
That's right.
I've met with victims of all sorts for years and years and years. And one of the things I've done regularly when I get to meet them, and I meet them on a one-on-one basis when I do that, is try to develop a bit of trust, kind of a rapport. And one of the things I've regularly done and said is, look, I've been a member of the clergy myself for a lot of years. I'm one of them. So I want to take this opportunity to tell you how sorry I am for what we have done to you. Not, I'm sorry for the pain you've had, I'm sorry for the problems, but I'm sorry for what we have done to you. And I do not recall one person saying to me, "Oh, well, thanks, but that's already been done. Somebody already apologized to me." Not once in 30 years, and more victims than I can count. That's a profound flaw in the institution's understanding of who the people are and what pastoral care is.
And the lawyers didn't look very good. As a lawyer, I'm embarrassed by some of the conduct. I know the church or a diocese has a right to be defended, but as I sit here, I remember one case where a 6-year-old child was molested, and in the pleadings, the lawyer for the diocese put in a defense of contributory negligence, which in the law, you know, if you're contributorily negligent, you can be excused. You can excuse the primary wrongdoer. And I asked the lawyer, I said, how on earth can you say a 6 or 7-year-old child was contributorily negligent to a violent sex act? You know, it was beyond me, but it's...
We have that involved. We have cases like that.
Yeah.
And I think some of those stories were among the most shocking.
Yeah.
For sure.
It still goes on. That's not a dead issue. Dick, what is it? What was your famous statement about the defense attorneys you made one time that got us both in trouble because I agreed with it publicly?
Don't remind me of my past sins.
Richard said publicly one time that in his experience, the lawyers representing the institutional church were some of the most morally challenged people he'd ever seen. I was asked that in a speech I gave one time, and the guy said, do you agree with that? And I said, completely. He said, he's older and wiser than I am. But I was asked that in court at a deposition one time. The lawyer said, did you actually say this? I said, I wish I had. But one of my dear brothers is the one that actually said it, but I agreed. So he looked at me and said, do you think I'm morally challenged? And I said, well, I'll let you know at the end of the deposition.
I think at that point, maybe we want to open this up to the crowd. So I'm going to hand off this mic. This is the one we're going to use. But first of all, thank you all so much.
Susan actually is behind me if you want to ask a question. I'm going to be selfish and ask the first question. Hi, first of all, thank you so much. And I just want to get another round of applause for Aiden. He's a freshman. I actually had someone text me during this and say Aiden is a rising star, so I'll have you happen. You know, we were joking backstage that there isn't quite any opposition on this panel, which is great, and I think this is a hard thing to actually have opposition on, clearly. There's facts here. But I'm a practicing Catholic, and, you know, I've obviously struggled with this and struggled with how I can reconcile, as Aiden mentioned. So I'm wondering, obviously you've all followed the story closely after you've since, you know, first reported on it. What are the signs of hope you're seeing? I assume there are small ones. And you know, sort of what can we look forward to? Is there progress being made? Yeah, just to sort of lift the mood a bit. What signs of hope?
Well, let's not forget that there are a great, great many wonderful priests who are almost hurt more than, not as much as the victims by this. I remember interviewing one of them, and he said, you know, Mr. Bennett, he said he's coming to my office for an interview. And he said, I'll never forget it. He said, I got off the plane and I had to go to the bathroom, and in front of me was a woman with 2 little boys, and she told the little boys to go into the bathroom, and then she saw my collar, and she says, I was going in, and she said, no, wait a minute, come here. And he said it was like taking a knife and putting it through my heart. So, that's, you know, that was a very powerful thing.
Yeah, that's actually a good sign, an optimistic sign of sessions like this, where we can talk about it, and people can confront the issues and ideally press for reform within the church itself.
Okay, so I don't know if mine is maybe on the more harsh side compared to Helen's, but at least in the years, I think Aiden identified Spotlight as like this turning point. So from 2002, the last year since then, what sort of legal action do you see being taken against priests who have been identified as sex offenders, at least for the victims where the statute of limitations still applies?
mean the action against the priests themselves?
Yeah, just, do you see a good majority of them going to jail? What's happening is still to
number-
under the rug.
Okay, she asked the question, did everybody hear the question? What kind of legal action has been taken against priests? And the caboose to that should be, what about the bishops? If they're the number one culprits. There have been an increasing number of criminal actions against priests, and they have been convicted. And what's important to understand is you have more people like prosecutors and district attorneys who are not being excessively deferential to the local church and saying, well, there's not enough information here to prosecute, where the guy gets off the hook, mainly because he's a priest. Well, that's happening less and less, which is...
You know, I could add to that a related point. There is a huge legal battle going on all over the country between survivors and the Catholic Church. And it's a fight over increasing the statute of limitations for civil litigation. In other words, the period of time people have to file lawsuits against the church in order to recover damages. And it's being fought state by state and legislature by legislature. And it's really a pitched battle right now. And I think from the point of view of survivors, it's not very attractive.
What the problem with that is, he's right. In every state where there's action to change the state laws to be more beneficial for victims, in terms of the statute of limitations, which prevents certain ones after a number of years from going back to court, or the requirements for mandatory reporting, the only opposition is from the Roman Catholic bishops of that state. And they expend millions and millions of dollars in the different states to oppose any forward motion. They use all kinds of tactics, some dirty, some downright dishonest, and some, kind of skimming on the surface to prevent it from happening. And the only reason for the opposition is not because they're wedded to the concept of the statute of limitations. Most bishops don't even know what it is. But it's because if this happens, there'll be more victims allowed to come forward. It will cost more money, but more important, it will be continuously embarrassing for the institution.
Thank you for coming to speak to us. This is a problem that goes on in the church around the globe, as you guys have mentioned. It's taking place in the US, Mexico, Ireland, and France, actually most recently in the past 3 weeks. And a lot of what you guys are talking about, the main problem is people are covering it up and not preventing it in the first place, which is the biggest problem we're facing right now. So just recently, the Archbishop of the Diocese in Lyon, Archbishop Barbarian, which is an interesting name, finally removed a bishop who had been accused in 2007, but he was still allowed to practice until 2015. He molested Boy Scouts 25 years before, so there's a statute of limitations that varies. And after all these other bishops have answered the press saying that molesting is not a sin, how can they help? How can the church play a role in helping the victims afterwards in terms of treatment or no contact orders or anything? How do you think that they can play a role themselves or with a judiciary after the fact?
First of all, they have to tell the truth. If the bishops would tell the truth, they could be very largely exonerated to some degree. As long as it is secret, as long as it is handled as a secret world, it's going to proliferate. See, one of the questions of this is, what does this mean for the average Catholic? Well, the Catholic Church has lost a great deal of credibility. There's no question about this. The Pew research on religion has said that 1/3 of people who have been brought up Catholics now identify themselves as ex-Catholics. And to a large degree, this has to do with the revelation how the system works. When Marty Baron in the movie says to his staff, "I'm interested in the system," I cried. I couldn't help myself, because for several decades, that's what I worked on, the system. It's in the system. Now that means two things for people like you. You have to be more responsible more proactive in taking responsibility for your own sexual development, your own moral development. You don't have somebody up here saying French kissing is wrong. You have to decide on the terms of relationship, on the terms of responsibility, and the terms of rationality.
You are dating yourself when you do French kissing. I don't even know what
It's okay. The other thing is that I think the systemic is what you and I are going to have to face in the future. Because the question is, we know, I don't think there's anybody who will argue that there's a certain proportion of men in this group that sexually get involved with minors. But what does this mean about the system that picks them, fosters them, comforts them, and covers them up? That's the next scandal that's going to come out. The sex in the system of people who advertise celibacy.
You know, let's, and this is not a everyone does it defense. I think the church is particularly responsible given what it purports to be. But this is one of our country's or the world's dirty secrets. You know, there's an enormous amount of sexual abuse, particularly of young girls in families and in all sorts of institutions. And, you know,
Bob, you're absolutely right. It is a huge problem. I'll tell you, I've dedicated my life to understand it within this system, among these people whom I love and I care about. I mean, I'm not throwing darts. I've written, I published 7 books on celibacy. I'm a great advocate. I taught in seminaries. I believe that celibacy is not taught as it should be, and I think it should be. But that's been my life. But you're going to see it in your own life, your own sexual development, because we all have a sexual development. We all have sexual responsibilities. We have relationships. And we want those to be responsible and useful and lasting. So, but be prepared, because this, if you want to call it scandal, this reality is not over yet. And it needs a great deal of support from inside the church, you know, of priests who declare themselves and who embrace their celibacy publicly, okay, and then can be themselves.
if we had no requirement of celibacy, do you think we would have less of a problem?
I do. I think that mandatory celibacy is impossible. I've been told that by Jesuits. Mandatory celibacy. The second thing is the exclusion of women from levels of authority in the church is very destructive. It's not a new I think that celibacy will flourish because it's flourished for centuries in all sorts of religious traditions. But I think it cannot be mandatory, and I think that the authority has to be based on people of commitment, and women and men. And I think it's going to come. So.
What about the role of homosexuality, which is a very sensitive subject? I concluded, after 2 years, that probably more than half priests have homosexual tendencies. Now, most of them don't act on it and are wonderful, caring priests. But what is that relationship from
first of all,
your studies?
We have to look at it. I mean, you're looking at it. Is there a fact? And orientation is different than behavior. Tom Reese, Jesuit from New York, anyway, he's been up there. I think actually his family comes from California.
Yes.
Said in 2013 at Santa Clara College, we were at a conference And Tom Rees said that if 100 homosexually oriented priests got together and made a public statement and said, I am homosexual in orientation, I'm celibate, and I'm a priest. He said that this would put a wedge into this whole discussion. And I think he's on the track, you know? Jesuits are usually ahead of the game. I think this is right. Now, homosexual marriage, I think, in all my studies, I think scientifically, homosexual orientation is a natural gift. Yeah, I can't think of it any other way. Now, behavior, we have to take responsibility for our behavior, no matter what our orientation is. But in terms of God-given responsibility, and I think it's hard for everyone to come to terms with their orientation and their behavior and their relationships.
But you agree that homosexuality has virtually nothing to do with pedophilia, but it does have something to do with the teenage boy on the camping trip with the priest.
Well, it can, and you're getting into some real tough questions.
Your question.
These are the tough questions.
Yeah, well, I know.
Can I return to your question, which was, what can the church do for the victims? The first thing is embrace them, acknowledge them, do not treat them the way they've been treated, which is like they're the enemy. The victims should be treated like the most important individuals in the church and given everything they can out of support. Now, that doesn't mean most victims want to have nothing to do with the institutional church. And the craziest thing that you can do is try to con them into coming back in as practicing members. I was asked one time, well, think of how many people you've got back as practicing Catholics who are victims. I said, are you out of your mind? That's the last thing I want to do, because that's like asking, somebody who was a victim at Auschwitz to go back there and celebrate Passover, where the harm happened. So the most important thing is when the institution begins to see itself as what it says it is, which is a community of believers, and not just a hierarchy running the show. But they have to treat these men and women, no matter how old or young they are, with the utmost respect and sensitivity. And then things will start to change, because that has not happened, and is not happening.
So you almost addressed my question, which was going to be, and maybe those of you who have been clergy members yourselves might have more insight into this, but the absence of women and its effect on this phenomena, and then going forward, whether or not you see that as a remedy to, as you said, this widespread phenomenon. Both as priests and very high up in that.
The Catholic Church is made up of 1.17 billion people of all sorts. The leadership, the actual leadership of that 1.17 billion is about 2,800 celibate male clerics who are all bishops and above. Now figure that one out, and it'll tell you a lot about what some of the problems are. One of the major issues with all of this is the clerical subculture. It's a very highly secretive elite that's run by men who have been taught in many of their much of the traditional training to justify celibacy, that relationships are not good, marriage is not good, women are temptresses, all this kind of nonsense. It's absolute total craziness. And I think, to get away from all of that, I've often wondered if, for example, we had married priests and women priests in the diocese, and the word gets out that a couple of the priests somewhere are violating little children. Now, do you think these women and the wives of the priests are going to sit back and do nothing? What's the bishop going to do when they storm his house and say, Jack, you better straighten up, because something's wrong with this picture and you're in it? Now, that would be one pragmatic, I think, effect. But it's a social change. It's going to amount to a gradual, very gradual, but a very profound cultural, social change. where it has to go in a way that's real. And the way it is now is certainly not real, where the whole thing is run by a small, tiny group of celibate men. The percentage between the total membership of the Catholic Church and the clerical subculture. The clerical subculture constitutes, and I've done the numbers, here's 0.0000074%. That's a pretty weird imbalance, to say the least.
You know, we've talked a lot about the lack of compassion for children and victims, and the lack of understanding in the documents we've seen for the effect of abuse on children. And it's hard to believe that that lack of understanding and compassion would exist if there were women in the clergy or women in more positions of power in the church. And I know just anecdotally, I didn't do a study on this, but just being in Boston and knowing a lot of families in Boston, including very devout families, I think a lot of the outrage, and it's the only word for it, at cardinal law and what had happened in the Boston Archdiocese was being driven by mothers around the dinner table at night. So I really do think that if there were women clergy, that this problem would be ameliorated to some significant degree.
I think we have time for about 2 more questions.
So this will be your second to last question.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to have with you at Jesuit Catholic School. I think it's important that, especially after Spotlight, these issues come out even more into the open. And my question is really about the Catholic political hierarchy as it conflicts with kind of the secular political hierarchies we have in modern nation states, especially here in America, where there's such a diversity of religions, diversity of ideologies. And for a long time, pretty much since the Catholic Church has existed, it's conflicted with the political hierarchies of its members and of its member states. And it seems like with this development, a lot of the legitimacy and a lot of the power that the Catholic Church has over its members in America and in the world in general has dissipated to some extent. So my question is, how do you see the future of the political authority of the Catholic Church as it relates to its loss of legitimacy surrounding this abuse scandal?
I think, I've seen, first off, people say that the institutional church, and there's a big distinction between the institutional church, which is the governing system, and the people of God, which is the church, moves at a glacial pace. And that's an exaggeration. It's even slower than that. But what this has done, this whole phenomenon, has done more to change the face, the political, cultural face of the institution than anything else that's happened in the past at least 1,000 years. Because it has placed the system in a spotlight and exposed many of the deficiencies. The deficiencies in what the church is itself, what it means to, what priesthood means, and so on. So what this is doing is very slowly, I think, but very gradually, changing the awareness of many of the lay people that when they get involved, if they're involved with the institution, they have to be, and they have to initiate the fact that they're on a level playing field with Father or the bishop. That they have as much to say, if not more, and just as much legitimacy, and forget all this deference. You know, if what Father says must be so, what the bishop says must be so. That's nonsense. Most of these guys don't know from nothing. But that's one of the things that's happening. It's caused that to happen, where it's exposed the weaknesses in the ivory tower that was the hierarchy and in the clerical elite, where they become aware of the fact that this education that we had, that a lot of priests had, was almost useless because it's about classical philosophy and so on and so forth, which just doesn't work in the real world today.
Well, I would say there also, we tend to think of what's happening here in the United States and maybe what's happening in other developed countries, but I think there's a serious lack of attention to this issue and an enduring lack of attention to this issue in the developing world. I don't think there's much happening there at all. I don't think the parishioners in these countries are raising these issues in the way that they are in the developed world, and I don't think the church has responded the States, even if there's more work to be done here in the United States, at least they've done something. There are conversations like this, but conversations like this are generally not taking place in the developing world, which is pretty much the bulk of the world. So,
in one sentence, he's totally right. I've had a lot of contact with victims and their representatives from the developing world, Latin America, especially in Africa, where they're coming alive, finally. But the situation in those countries is completely horrific today. It's worse than it ever was in our country, and it was really bad here. But it's absolutely horrific there.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out and answering student questions, but my question concerned the movie, actually. One of the criticisms that I heard about the movie is that the lack of visual representation of sexual abuse might actually be softening the impact and decreasing the scale of the issue, and that the lack of visual depiction of sexual abuse might actually be perpetuating, in some way, the habits that the Catholic Church encourages of kind of circling around the topic rather than confronting it. So what would be your response to that?
Well, I guess I think the opposite may be true. I think kind of the genius of the movie really is to put the reporters between the viewers and the victims. I think if it was a movie that depicted sexual abuse, I think most people wouldn't go see it. I mean, maybe that's unfortunate, but I think that's the reality. And I think that by making the story about the reporters and not about the details of sexual abuse itself, I think it allowed people to go sit through the movie and have a greater appreciation of the issue and the phenomenon than they otherwise would have. Because I think if word got out that you would go see this movie and see someone being a child being sexually abused, I think people would stay away.
I disagree with that hypothesis entirely. I mean, I think the movie was exceptionally powerful in what it conveyed. And sometimes when you don't show things, it can be more powerful than when you do. I think people would have been very focused on the graphic nature of it as opposed to the emotional impact and psychological impact on the abuse survivors. And that is what the movie focused on. And so I think it actually enhanced the power of the movie, not to dwell on that. And on top of that, as Mike said, as a result, more people saw the movie. I don't think there would have been very many people who would have seen the movie if it had graphic representations of sexual abuse.
I think as it is, a lot of people have not seen the movie for that reason. People have said to me, gosh, I kept telling myself I should see the movie, but I didn't want to see it because I thought I was going to go and see sexual abuse. And when I went and I didn't see that, and I was so happy that I could stand to sit through it.
And with that in mind, I want to say thank all five of you for being out here today and talking about this. Thank you, Father Carnes, for coming out and speaking as well. It was really insightful. Thank all of you for coming as well. Thanks for that.